Thank you. So in the last talk, we were left with the question, how do we get out of this mess? And so I'd like you to hold this thought as we go through this session. We have globally, the entire built environment, the building sector, consists of about 2.4 trillion square feet of building. In the next 4 decades, just 4 decades, we're expected to build 2.4 trillion square feet of building. Essentially, think about it, a whole new planet, the planet we have now, we're gonna build it again, gonna take down some buildings, but add it to what we have. So keep that thought in mind as we go through this and we look to answer the question, how do we get out of this mess? So I renamed the talk, Time to Quit. It's actually the cover of the new Architect magazine. So if you type in architectmagazine.com, it's the new AIA publication, January issue. So we know right now we're in a climate emergency. Everybody is talking about it. But the big issue now is timing, and timing is everything. And the key is the time to quit and the timing of that, of ending essentially the fossil fuel era. Now you've all seen the headlines. The world has just over a decade to get climate change under control. And we talk about avoiding racing past the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold that the scientific community has set if we want to avoid really dangerous climate change. We also have a young climate activist running around the world talking about carbon budgets. And not many people really understand carbon budgets. So I'm going to try to put that together with the 1.5 for you. This was in 2013. This was the IPCC ran a whole bunch of scenarios for different climate budgets, and 2.2 trillion tons of carbon down to 1.3, and then they ran a 1.5 degree C scenario, and that's where we don't go above 2 degrees C. We stay roughly at around 1.5 in that area, and then the climate actually begins to return to pre-industrial conditions. So climate change actually becomes reversible if we stay under that threshold. And you can see at the 1.5, we had at that time about 500 billion tons of carbon was our budget. 530 billion tons of carbon was the budget. Today, to stay under the 1.5, our carbon budget is now 340 billion tons of CO2, gigatons. And that gives us a high probability of staying under the 2 degrees, roughly at 1.5. So that's what the young activists are running around talking about when they say climate budgets and listen to the scientists. It's that 340 gigatons of CO2, billion tons. Okay, what does that mean? Well, you've all heard the term phase out by 2050. Cities are saying, well, we're going to go to carbon neutral by 2050. We're going to go to a clean grid by 2050. We see that 2050 date has been in the news for some time now, a number of years. We are roughly now at about 40 gigatons a year. That is what we're emitting globally. If we drew a straight line down from 40 gigatons all the way to 2050, we would burn up 600 gigatons, almost double what our carbon budget is. So the 2050 date is out the window. We burned up too much carbon to this date. So how do we meet the 1.5 degrees C carbon budget, the 340 gigatons, to have a high probability to stay under the 2 degrees C. This is what the curve looks like. We need a 65% reduction between now and 2030 of CO2 emissions, and then we have to phase out all CO2 emissions by about 2040. There's a little wiggle room in here, and depending upon how close we want to get to the 1.5. But that's what it looks like. Now, how doable is this? Is this even possible? Well, if we want to peak, we need to peak this next year in 2020, or this year now in 2020. We need to do two things. We need to call for us in the built environment. This is what our role is. We need to call for no new gas and coal plants and eliminate gas hookups for the building sector. If we do that and we bring in new buildings at zero net carbon, we will peak. So that's how we peak at this point in time. And then by 2030, if we phase out all coal plants and of the existing building sector, we electrify roughly 50% of the existing building sector. This is globally. And we reduce the emissions from the average emissions of steel and concrete 50%. This is what happens if we do those things over the next 10 years. We get right down into the sweet spot. So all of a sudden, a graph that looks almost impossible to achieve doesn't look so daunting after all. And why is that? Well, the price of renewables keeps plunging to where now renewables are much, much cheaper than coal. And we see in the US we're phasing out coal plants at an accelerated rate. And renewables are actually, across the board, reducing dramatically to where now they can compete with gas and oil in terms of generating power. And we're now starting to see electrification in transportation. So the world's largest bank now says it's inevitable that we phase out coal, and that's coming really, really quickly because renewables and renewable electricity is now competing with oil on the world stage. Berkeley, a few months ago, 3-4 months ago, enacted a gas ban, no new hookups for new buildings of natural gas. Within 3 months, 13 cities had already passed gas bans in California. It's now over 20 cities, and it's spreading to Massachusetts, New York. The governor just announced 3 days ago, $2 billion to get off of natural gas in the building sector. So this is spreading really quickly. And even under Trump, renewables this year hit a record high in terms of expenditures and investment. So things are moving fairly rapidly. So what about that 2.4 trillion square feet? So we know that by 2060, roughly, the projections are that we'll double the global building stock. We also know that most of that construction is expected to take place in urban areas, in cities worldwide. And you've heard the term that we're building in New York City every 30-something days. That's where that comes from. But where is all this construction going to take place? In order to answer that question, how do we get out of this mess? We need to know where all this construction is going to take place so that we can sequence what we do. It's a map of the world. The darkest dot will be construction between now and 2030, roughly the next 10 years. The circle around that, lighter circle, would be 10 years after that, from 2030 to 2040, and then the lightest circle would be construction between 2040 and 2060, the doubling of the entire global building stock. So this is the next 10 years. So we see plenty of construction in the US and North America and Canada and Mexico. We still see construction in Europe, and we see construction in China. So in the global north, we see most of the construction. India starts picking up, Southeast Asia, a little bit in Africa, some in Latin America. But really, those three areas, North America, Europe, and China, have a real big role to play now. Now let's look at 10 years after that. And we see India picking up, Africa picking up, some in Latin America, Southeast Asia. Construction starts to move to the global south from 2030 to 2040. And then from 2040 to 2060, you have an explosion of construction in Africa, India, Southeast Asia. So it's important to get it right in the global north in order to influence what happens in the global south. That has to be the sequence. So the built environment, what we deal with, consists of three elements: new buildings that we build every day, existing buildings, that 2.4 trillion that we have out there now needs to be dealt with, and all the materials and construction and all the materials that go into buildings and infrastructure needs also to be dealt with, and we'll take them one at a time. So, new buildings and existing buildings, we understand as building operations. So that's the first thing we need to deal with. So how are we doing with that? This is US, we'll look at the US first. This is US building sector operations consumption, mostly fossil fuels, from 1995 to 2005. And you can see it's a straight line up at about 45 degrees, and the projections were in 2005 that we would just keep on going because nothing was changing at that time. In 2003 was the first time we discovered there was even a building sector that was using emissions. In 2002, if you read the headlines in the papers at that time, we were burning down SUV dealerships. There was one burnt down in Denver, and the poster child of climate change and carbon emissions was the SUV. 2002, we discovered the building sector. In 2003, there was a seminal issue in Metropolis magazine called Architects Pollute, where we discovered that the building sector was a problem. In 2005, we issued the 2030 Challenge targets to the building sector and the architecture profession. So what happened from 2005 to today? Let's put that in motion. We've roughly flattened out emissions. So even though we've added 30, 40, maybe even slightly more billion square feet of building to our building stock during that period, we haven't increased emissions at all. We've actually reduced it slightly. So the building sector is flat. We keep bringing in new buildings. Our building codes are much better. We keep bringing in new buildings fairly efficient. We keep renovating a bunch of buildings. And in the US, we have peaked emissions. We have peaked energy consumption in our building sector. What about emissions? This is where we were in 2005. And let me put in motion from 2005 to this year, 2019. We just got in the latest numbers. That's the US building sector greenhouse gas, CO2 emissions. We're down 21% now in emissions in the US building sector. Now, how did we do that? There are two things we did. One is every time, if we're not increasing energy consumption, every time we put a collector on a building, or we add any renewables, it reduces emissions because it's replacing fossil fuels. And switching from coal to gas, which is problematic, but also reduced CO2 emissions. But we have to get off of gas. So that one's problematic. But those two things combined brought us down 21%. So we're getting very close in the building sector to meet the US commitment under the Paris Agreement of 26 to 28% by 2025. However, we have a lot of work to do. That's good for the US. We have a lot of work to do in the rest of the world, but primarily, right now, we need to focus on North America, Europe, and China. We need a zero code immediately, zero net carbon code. All buildings now need to come in at zero net carbon, so all the renovations we're doing, the bringing energy consumption, we need to start bringing that down and emissions down even further. If we bring buildings in at zero net carbon, then every renovation, every collector we put up reduces emissions even further now. We don't have to offset all those new buildings. So we developed the zero code. We have an international and national zero code, zero net carbon code standard. It's beginning to get adopted. It's fairly simple. You take any efficient code and then you add the renewables to it. Our codes are fairly efficient now. They get more efficient every 3 years. If you incentivize efficiency through the code by requiring the renewables, every time you save $1 through efficiency, you actually save $2 or more because now you don't have to add the renewables or buy them. So by doing it that way, you actually begin to bring those buildings in at zero net carbon, and then all the renovations begin to drive things down. So we have a zero code now in the US. We were over in China and presented the zero code, and China just released their own zero code. It's called Nearly Zero Energy plus the on-site and off-site renewables. However, it's voluntary now, and we have to start pushing them to really get it adopted in cities in China. Oh. The European Union is mandated, all the countries of the European Union are mandated now to have a zero net carbon code. They call it a nearly zero energy building code standard. So it's nearly zero energy buildings plus the on-site and nearby off-site renewables. This year, every country is mandated to get a code in place this year in Europe. So in those three areas that we need to deal with right now, we have a way forward. The question is activating it and pushing it really quickly. The good news is we put in a zero code in the International Energy Conservation Code as an appendix so that on any, if you're at the 2021, 2019, 2016, whatever international energy conservation code you're using, you can add the appendix and get the zero net carbon. So essentially now, every city in the US and around the world can activate a zero code. What about, that's hopefully the 2.4 trillion we're going to add in terms of emissions. What about the 2.4 trillion square feet of existing building stock? How do we deal with that? How do we develop policies? That has to happen on a policy level. How do we develop the policies for existing buildings? Well, that's a photograph, aerial photograph of Seattle. Notice where all the big buildings are. There's a concentration of big buildings in downtown Seattle. And then you see miles and miles. That's not even the extent of the Seattle boundary, but you see miles and miles of small buildings, 1-story, 2-story buildings. What we found out was in Seattle, 2.8% of the buildings were actually large buildings over 20,000 square feet. So 5,000 buildings were over 25,000 square feet, 20,000 square feet, and 97%, over 97% of the buildings were small buildings under 20,000 square feet. It was 176,000 buildings were small buildings, all those small buildings all around the downtown core. And what was equally amazing was that 2.8% of the buildings, those 5,000 buildings, were responsible for 45% of all of Seattle's building sector emissions. So very few buildings are responsible for roughly half of Seattle's buildings. And then you have hundreds of thousands of other buildings that are responsible for the other half. We looked at New York, and if you look at New York, you see where all the big buildings are in Midtown, Lower Manhattan, and downtown Brooklyn. And then you have miles and miles of small buildings. And in New York, the cutoff was 50,000 square feet. Less than 2% of the buildings, or 26,000, a little over 26,000 buildings in New York, are over 50,000 square feet, the big high-rises in those three areas. And almost 1 million buildings are small buildings under 50,000 square feet. Those 2% are responsible for 48% of all New York City's greenhouse gas emissions. This is Long Beach. You see along the water all the tall buildings. 1% of the buildings are over 10,000 square feet in Long Beach, and they're responsible for 50%. And then you have miles and miles of small buildings. Look at any city in the US. We looked at every city. You have the same exact set of numbers. You just have to set the threshold. That's Boston, that's Philadelphia, that's Los Angeles, and that's Las Vegas. We also know that if you undertake energy efficiency improvements or energy upgrades, like trading out boilers for heat pumps and things like that, if you hit a capital improvement cycle, it costs about 75% less to do the upgrades. It's actually cheap. The payback is really quick. If you're hitting a capital improvement cycle, all the setup costs and all that, that's all taken care of. You don't have to redo all that. So if you can hit a capital improvement cycle and target what you do to those points, you overcome the entire issue of cost, the whole economic issue. So how do you do that? Well, you need policies for big buildings. You have very few big buildings. And then you need a small buildings policy, which is very different because you don't want 1 million people banging on your door, you're making me do this and you're making me do that. You've got to phase it in at building intervention points. So let's look at big buildings. How do you develop a policy for big buildings? You require building electrification by 2030. You give them 10 years to hit a capital improvement cycle, and then you require on-site or off-site and/or off-site renewable energy to get those buildings to zero net carbon. And you provide incentives so you don't get them all stacking up in 2030 for the people who want to go early. You give them incentives. You don't have that many buildings. You give them incentives to go really early, and so you spread it out over that 10-year period. Okay, what about these millions and millions of small buildings? You require electrification at what we call building intervention points, and then you require the on-site and off-site. You get over the hump of cost and financing when you do that. So what are building intervention points? Point of sale is a huge one. When a new owner comes in, they're getting a mortgage, they have money, they're usually going to renovate, the cost is cheap to get them to zero net carbon. point of a major renovation or equipment change-outs, those are other intervention points. Or if you're coming in for a zoning or use change, you're usually going to upgrade and you're getting something from the city that increases the value of the property, you need to go to zero net carbon. That's how you develop small building policy, and you provide the incentives, again, for smaller buildings, people who want to just get there quickly, you give them good incentives to do so right away. So that's how we take care of the existing building sector and the new buildings coming in. What about materials, construction, and infrastructure? 2.4 trillion square feet, roads, sidewalks, water, sewage, electricity, lighting, core and shell. It's enormous. The amount of materials is enormous. How do we get a handle on that? We call that embodied carbon. And up until 2018, no one talked about embodied carbon. It wasn't until September of last year where in San Francisco at the Climate Action Summit that we brought up the issue and began to discuss it and talk about solutions. And why has no one talked about embodied carbon? Think about it. There are literally millions of materials that go into buildings and infrastructure. You have seats, you have the stage here, you have screens, you have lighting, you have lights, you have walls, you have carpet, you name it, it's in a building. Every material that's produced is in buildings and infrastructure in the world. So how do you get a handle on that? And the materials subset and the people who deal with this issue have made it incredibly complex. They have their own language. And it's hard to break into that language. They have EPDs, PCRs, LCAs, CO2e. Who knows what a PCR is? Raise your hand. One person, two people, maybe three people in the audience. PCR is a product category rule. Product category rule is how you do apples to apples with a, let's say, carpet. You create a product category rule. Everybody has to play by that rule and count by those numbers. So there are millions of products, and we have to get a handle on that. So how do we do that? Well, we reshaped the pie back in 2003, and we now look to reshape it again. There's the belly, which is industry. 43% is all these materials and construction in the built environment. That's including all the other things that we use, like our computers and silverware and glassware and tables and furniture. All that's included in industry. Seems like an incredible, daunting challenge. But we reshaped the pie somewhat. We found out that core and shell of buildings are responsible for 11%. So that's the cement, that's the structure, substructure, and then the shell, the wall system around that is 11% of total industry, and then the other 32%, everything else falls in there. Still seemed like a daunting problem to address this issue. So we reshaped the pie again. And we found out that just 3 materials, basically 2 materials, were responsible for half of all industrial emissions and 20%, over 20% of global CO2 emissions, steel and concrete. Just 2 materials we have to get a handle on, and we can address half of that sector while we work on the other half. Now it becomes doable. But we're running up against an issue, and that's what we call the time value of carbon. And that's why we say timing is everything. This is embodied carbon and operational carbon. So embodied carbon is in blue. In year one of the buildings built between now, 2020, and 2060, that 2.4 trillion square feet. In year one of those buildings, so this is the buildings just built in 2020, almost all of the carbon is going to be obviously in building the building, because the building's only operating for a year, so there's only very little bit of carbon that's expended during this period. If we look in year two, we build about the same amount, and we took this out building roughly the same amount annually all the way out to 2060. In year two, we have the same amount of carbon in materials and construction. Now we have 2 years. We have buildings now built in 2020 and buildings built in 2021 operating. So in 2021, the operational carbon's a little double. That's year three. Now let's take it all the way out to 2050. So between now and 2050, 48% of all the carbon in the buildings built in the next 30 years is going to be building operations, and 52% is embodied carbon. So roughly 50-50 of all the buildings built in the next 30 years. However, we saw we have a 340 gigaton budget, and we have to get a 65% reduction in 10 years. So let's pull this back to 10 years, and we see that over the next 10 years, 28% of the buildings built in this next 10 years is operational carbon, and 72% is embodied carbon. And if we get a zero code in place, then all of it is embodied carbon. So we've got to get a handle on that. We also know that in a building, in just the building sector, 55% of all the embodied carbon is in the substructure and structure. Basically the steel and concrete, 33% in the covering in the building enclosure, and then the rest is in the interior. We also know that if we're renovating buildings, that we know where a lot of that carbon is. Carpet is huge in terms of carbon. And so we know how to get at that also. And all of a sudden now, in the last 2 years, all sorts of things are popping up. We have a materials palette where we talk about all these carbon issues and how to reduce emissions. We have EC3, which is a new program. We have Tally. There's all sorts of programs now on the market. So how do we get a handle on embodied carbon? What do we do? Well, the first thing is we have to change the conversation. We have to understand what it is. And we've started that already. And we have to get the word out about steel and concrete, which is huge. It's half of the whole industrial sector. And we're beginning to see now that happen. Concrete, the most destructive material on earth. It was also in the Wall Street Journal had, the New York Times. Everybody's talking about how bad concrete is. The architecture community actually is having meetings. We shouldn't build out of concrete anymore. We should build out of other materials. And steel not far behind. Right after concrete, headlines now, steel makers are next in the crosshairs as climate pressure grows. And mass timber is giving steel and concrete a run for their money. All of a sudden now, everybody wants to build out of timber. And we know that if it's sustainably sourced, it actually could be zero net carbon. And the American Institute of Architects and all its chapters have now picked up the mantle. This year, they passed a resolution, and they're working on their climate action plan now. They're devoting almost all of their resources now to climate action. This is the January issue of Architect Magazine, and the entire issue is about carbon, quitting carbon. It's the time to quit, and roughly almost every article in there is on how to do it. So, what are the things we now need to do? We started the conversation. We need to reduce, sequester, and reuse within our building community. Let's talk about reducing. That's a planning, design, and specification issue. That's creating growth boundaries so that we densify and we don't keep increasing the road structure and infrastructure. We look at infill rather than spreading out at the boundaries of cities, using the infrastructure that's available. We look at optimizing structure so that we're not just throwing extra material at structures and oversizing. We're looking at using low to zero carbon materials that are now coming on the market. If we just use US steel rather than importing steel, we reduce the steel's emissions from the average by about 50%. Because in the US we use electric arc furnaces, everywhere else they use coal furnaces and virgin steel. We use recycled steel and electric arc furnaces in the US. So just that one thing gets us a 50% reduction. And we're starting to see public policy. The first policy now in Marin County on concrete, on requiring low carbon concrete. What about sequestering? We need to go to carbon positive materials in landscape, zero carbon, carbon positive. Wood is becoming now a favorite within the building sector if it's sustainably sourced and harvested. And we see now, because of the pressure of wood, we see the building codes changing now to allow high-rise structures made out of mass timber. That just happened last year. We see carbon positive aggregate, actually making aggregate for concrete out of CO2, taking it out of the air, making aggregate, and then sequestering it in concrete. Blue Planet is pioneering that. We see carbon positive block walls, excuse me. Carbon Cure, another company, is taking CO2 and injecting it into the concrete mix to strengthen the mix and change the properties of CO2 so it permanently gets rid of the CO2 in concrete. And they're now looking at a full cycle plant, taking all the carbon from making the cement and then putting it into the concrete. The first plant will be in Los Angeles. There are ways to sequester carbon by increasing forestry, soils. And lastly, we talk about reuse. The building you don't build is the building where you save a huge amount of carbon by reusing existing buildings. And those are planning and design strategies. Upgrading areas and repurposing areas rather than tearing them down and rebuilding. Adaptive reuse and using recycled materials and local materials to save on transportation. And there's now a whole movement on deconstruction and material reuse, that we design our buildings so they can be deconstructed and then the materials reused so we don't have to trash them and burn them. So the question becomes, how do we get out of this mess? Can we meet the 1.5 degrees C carbon budget? And I'm going to leave you with this thought. This is a scale 1925 all the way out to 1952. That's 27 years, roughly the time frame that we want to get all of this under control. In 1925, we had what's considered the first modern building. There was some discussions on which one was more, but it was roughly around 1925 was the Bauhaus, where we didn't have just masonry walls and short spans, but now we had concrete pillars and columns and large spans, and we can actually then get light deep into a space. So rather than little small spaces, we now open the building up. That was the first modern building, and they hung the glass wall off of the structure. So now the exterior wall was not a masonry load-bearing wall. Considered the first modern building. At that time, to give you an idea of what things were like, the Model T had just come out before that, and in 25, they added a little piece to the back of the Model T, and that was the first truck, Model T truck, that actually came out. So that's what times were like then. In 1927, we had the first transatlantic call, was in 27. In 1932, we had an exhibit called the International Style. Took the Bauhaus teachings and everything else, and at the Museum of Modern Art, Philip Johnson created an exhibit called the International Style. Now, at that time, there was no transatlantic flights or anything. You had to come over on a steamer in order to give a lecture and then take a train somewhere to another university somewhere. So it took days and days to do any of that. But the international style then started to happen. It wasn't until 1935 in Newark that we had the first commercial airport actually taking flights for commercial use. In 1939, Frank Lloyd Wright designed the Johnson Wax building, and you can see the columns, big open space. The modern movement was now well on its way. In 1949, Philip Johnson did his all-glass house, single glass, by the way, in New Canaan, in Connecticut, really cold climate, demonstrated that we could overcome any climate and create that indoor-outdoor environment by just using cheap fossil fuels. By 1952, we had high-rise buildings built with single glass curtain walls and panels all around the world. The entire world by in the 50s was totally transformed. So from 1925 to 1950, over 27 years, we transformed the entire world. Now, all the buildings were rectangular, and that was because these are the materials we used to design all those buildings during that period. There was a T-square and a triangle. You see the ink pen. It was two prongs. You had to dip it in an inkwell to get the ink into those two prongs, then clean it off, and then draw a straight line with the triangle and T-square. And we had bumwad at that time as a great term, so I thought I'd put that in there. We used sketch at that time. It's pretty primitive. It took years to develop a set of construction documents. And when you draw with the ink pen, it would invariably leak under the T-square and the triangle, and you'd get a big blob of ink on your drawing, and the only way to get the ink off was with a razor blade. There were no erasers to do that. So think about how long it took Now, the lever house was built during that period. These are the tools we had to design the lever house. Think about how long it took to do that. And then the Seagram's building, huge skyscrapers, were done with those materials. And there were no curves. We had French curves, and we can draw a curve, but you couldn't dimension a curve in 3 dimensions. So every building built, except maybe a half circle, every building built in the world was rectangular. And for structures, we had no computers. Everything was done by slide rule. The great invention was the rapidograph that didn't come in until the 60s. This was after all these buildings are built. You could actually draw a line, not get the ink to come in under and take you years to do a set of drawings. The first Mac didn't come in until the 80s, in '84, and not until the 90s did we have the first laptop. So we changed the world in 27 years with primitive materials that took forever to get things done. Think about what we have now and how fast we can do things. So when we talk about between now and 2040 that the world is going to change, we have all the tools we need to make that change happen. We're going to bring all of that I showed. We're going to bring all the experts in March to Los Angeles to a conference. And the conference, we're looking at a how-to conference. So those who can begin to demonstrate the materials we need, carbon cure, steel, carbon sequestration, the zero codes, all of that we're bringing to a conference called Carbon Positive 20 in LA. And we're doing it with Architect and Hanley Wood. And Hanley Wood just sent this over to us. If you come to this conference and you actually pay to come to this conference, they're going to discount the cost of coming to this plus a little bit to go to the conference in LA. So if you are looking to go to that conference, type in the discount code GREENBUILDER and you'll get a big discount on the attendance of that. So you can go to www.carbon-positive.org and hopefully we'll see you all in a few months. Thank you.